All right, and it's another wet, cold Washington day. God, I seem to be saying that a lot. It's been going on for a while. And I know it's officially spring, but the weather doesn't seem to know it yet. However, take the opportunity before I continue my discussion of Kenjutsu, Japanese sword versus, like HEMA. I wanted to find a couple of terms I use to describe different martial arts. And there are certainly other terms, which is definitely going to apply to our discussion of Japanese swordsmanship versus whatever else, and Chinese swordsmanship versus whatever else. The terms that I have chosen to use myself are these: pragmatic versus ritual. Now, pragmatic, well, it's pretty obvious. I'm talking about practical martial arts in terms of stuff that is effective, efficient at what would be considered its primary function. Self-protection, personal combat, even sport. It's adaptive, kind of evolves and learns, okay? The other one, ritual. Now, this has nothing to do with traditional versus modern, because the two terms can apply to something that's hundreds of years old or more, or something that's been created in the last couple decades. They can start as one thing and change into the other, or not, to different degrees very slowly or very quickly. Ritual, well, the less kind terms. Fantasy, fake, bullshito. I'm not going to use those, because even in the most ritual practice, I still see benefit. And if you're doing it and getting benefit out of it, don't stop. I'm not telling you to stop. And even in some of the most ritualized techniques, there may still be some pragmatic stuff you can pull out of that. There's reasons why some of that stuff is still done and some that have been forgotten. But I'm also going to divide this discussion into two other terms, what I call big versus small. The big stuff are the major underlying concepts. The biomechanics, the strategies, distance maneuvering, timing, those kind of things that make the rest of it either work or not work. The small, the individual techniques. Now, a lot of the ritual martial arts might focus too much on the small techniques and just not focus on the big techniques, or focus maybe on the wrong big techniques, or withhold the big stuff for advanced students. Yeah, no, I'm not into that. But what I found, the more martial arts I study, the pragmatic ones, the big stuff is all pretty similar, if not completely identical. And then I start seeing similarities across all the small stuff because of that. And this would include HEMA, right? The challenger in my katana verses, right? The up-and-comer, which is not really an up-and-comer. It's traditional in its roots. People studying those old manuals and manuscripts and then trying to revive that art, but in doing so, not looking at the ritual. They're trying to apply it in live fighting. And as part of that, they're also cross-training. Different weapons against different weapons, different styles against different styles, also inviting other practitioners from other styles to come in and pressure test, to constantly improve and refine this very old art. That's also how I'm going to address the conversation about Japanese swordsmanship against HEMA. I'm going to focus on the pragmatic, and like I said, in the pragmatic, they have more in common than they don't. All right, my own background. As I've talked about, and I'm not going to name names of particular schools, but I'll talk about some styles that I've encountered, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the beautiful about them. 45 years ago, I got into martial arts because I was a sickly kid, and one of my high school teachers said, you should probably put your brilliant mind into improving that body of yours. And martial arts was my choice because, well, talked about in other videos, my hideous temper, penchant for violence, and my love of weapons and such. And I was inspired in the early 70s by the Kung Fu TV series, right? And wanted to be that guy. But not necessarily that guy, but in one episode they introduced the weapons master of Shaolin, right? I wanted to be that guy. He was only in like one or two episodes because that was kind of sad. Anyway, I chose karate because it was close and they practiced kobudo, weapons. And if you know anything about kobudo, you also know that certain of the kobudo weapons enhance your empty hand practice. And they let me practice it because I showed talent and dedication and respect and safety. Weapons because, well, I'm 5'7". And back then, and for the first decade plus of my martial arts career, I weighed about 120 pounds. I don't anymore. Now I look more like Wilson Fisk or, Marlon Brando from Apocalypse Now, or maybe the guy who should be out there killing James Bond right now, but, we'll talk about that another day. And besides just being 5'7", if you've seen longer shots of me where you get to see more of my body, you do the Vitruvian Man thing, and you may have noticed my arms look strangely short. My arm span would say I'm less than 5 feet tall, just the way I'm built. So, going into a fighting art with a severe deficit in weight and reach, and yeah, there's people who say, there's advantages to that. It's like, yeah, no, there's a lot more to overcome, guys. So I was looking at equalizers. And again, I was already interested in weapons, and that made perfect sense. So, yeah, that also then influenced some of the other directions I went in. But red flags about that system, I would consider this a mainland Japanese style of karate compared to an Okinawan system. And you guys know the difference, know that changes were made when it was brought to Japan. It also borrowed some techniques from Taekwondo, especially kicking. And even though I've kind of walked away from it to this day, I still practice that kicking, those kicking dynamics. Even though I've learned kicking in a lot of other martial arts styles, I still go back to karate and taekwondo. If you want to learn great kicking, karate and taekwondo are at the top of my list. But otherwise, this school would be what I would consider red flag for ritual, but I didn't really know any better at the time. I started figuring it out pretty quickly. Red flags would include things like very rigid attention to kata. This was a system that allowed you, if you had talent and the dedication to master and perform the kata and a couple of the surface applications, the bunkai, the really basic hit, block hit kind of things, you could rank up really fast and get a black belt in a couple, 3-4 years. That's what I did. That's what I invested in. However, despite how good I got in the classroom, when I took it out of the classroom, either cross-training or unfortunately in real fights, it didn't work like it worked in the classroom. It started telling me something. And of course, bringing that to your instructor, you get told not to question it, that you just need to try harder, and 20, 30, 40 years down the road, I was getting suspicious. Other red flags like rigid postures, rigid techniques and stances and stepping that don't allow free adaptive maneuvering and distancing. Not a lot of the big, guys. Most focus on the small. The big was kind of being withheld for later or maybe never. That made it very ineffective against an adaptive live fighter. Your opponent in your applications was restricted to, doing a very specific attack, a very specific way, and then pretty much freezing and complying with you while you did, whatever you were going to do to him. Sparring was very regulated and restricted to non-contact or point. It's like the first touch wins. That's one of the reasons why I don't like kendo or foil fencing. For me, it's like two-person tag, and I never saw such a thing happen in real life, that somebody just stops after they get touched the first time. Yeah, that's more of a game, and it's a valid sport. There's a lot of things you can learn from it, but not fighting, shall we say. So yeah, a couple of things. Some of my instructors were perfectly cool with me cross-training, others were not so much. Or bringing in other information or asking questions. All red flags. All right. Well, at the same time, like I said, I was very interested in weapons, so I made the rounds of the various knife shops and martial arts stores, and a lot of them were in schools. A lot of those schools were in different arts. This is also where I met the people who started teaching me Japanese swordsmanship and also introduced me to grappling. Despite how well I was doing in karate, first time I encountered a grappler, well, I could surprise them with some stuff that they hadn't been doing. But as soon as they got a hold of me, I was done. I mean, yeah, useless. That was a big wake-up call. So I started, whether my instructors approved of it or not, cross-training. Now, some of my instructors, like I said, approved of it, encouraged it, did question and encourage that growth, evolution, personalization. Also, they turned me on to the old masters. So, a lot of my best teachers were live, and a lot of them were long not alive. And that's also, what you see in HEMA, studying the old masters. Musashi was one of my favorites, and his primary advice which, is often attributed to Bruce Lee, is study it all. Study as much as you can to learn what they're doing and what works for them, and then maybe take that into what your practice is to improve your practice. So you got more tools in your toolbox. You can refine what you're doing, and also at least be prepared for that. If you encounter it, you know what to expect. Yeah, so I started cross-training in grappling arts, jiu-jitsu, Aikido-jitsu, and we'll talk about Aikido in a second, yeah. But hearing that the Japanese martial arts had come from China, I started, as soon as my first opportunity presented itself, diving headlong into Chinese martial arts, as much as I could eat up. And also, Chinese martial arts has a lot of weapons. So, wow, that was fun and exciting. So I invested in studying a lot of Chinese martial arts, and very quickly left karate behind. All those years I spent mastering those forms to level up. To this day, I cannot remember any of them enough to perform them. I can recognize them when I see them, but that's it. Do I regret some of that? Well, maybe. Because there are things, again, you can take from a ritual martial art and make it pragmatic that I may have lost over time. However, Chinese martial arts, a lot of them have a reputation for being ritual. Yeah. And I studied, like I said, a lot of different kinds, but I was able to find the pragmatic in it as I moved forward, just as I studied Aikido at the same time. Yeah, I spent a few years in Aikido. It's actually a lot of years in Aikido, not a few. Why did I stick with it? Well, ritual, absolutely, and I knew it from, pragmatic practice and other martial arts. I knew that they were doing, what they were doing was more like the ballet of jiu-jitsu, but a lot of the underlying big concepts were the same or similar to the pragmatics that allowed me another venue to refine and practice those. The individual techniques, not so much. I recognize them for what they were, which they're beautiful. There's an art form and a discipline. There's a reason it still exists and it's popular. It's lovely to watch. Is it pragmatic and effective? No. The big, though, that it has in common with other pragmatic arts, absolutely. Same thing with the Chinese arts. So I learned dozens and dozens and dozens of forms of Chinese arts, and again, most of them I've forgotten and left behind. There's a core of them that I've kept, but let me tell you, they don't look anything like the way they were when I was taught them, because I've adapted them to me and to being pragmatic more than ritual. Have I polluted them in the process? Well, you could argue that as well. But they work for me. What kinds of things am I talking about? Wing Chun, for instance. I spent, many years studying Wing Chun, and there are Wing Chun techniques I use to this day. Now, Wing Chun is one of those that has an inflated reputation in itself as being an ultimate martial art, but outside of Wing Chun, it's considered to be ritualized and kind of sad. And it doesn't really deserve that, because it does have pragmatic application if you strip away those ritual things that send it in the wrong direction and cross-train with it and adapt it. So yes, I've adapted Wing Chun, and I still use a lot of Wing Chun moves, but they don't look like Wing Chun anymore. Praying Mantis, one of my favorite all-time Praying Mantis. We're not talking, when you see somebody do this, it's not the Praying Mantis I'm talking about. That's more like Wushu Praying Mantis. Wushu is very ritualized. Japanese or Chinese martial arts practice, right? It's what I've described in other videos as being like rhythmic gymnastics with some fight choreography. It's beautiful, it's physical, but it's not fighting. But the Praying Mantis I studied was very practical, very effective and efficient for medium to close range combat. And one of the major things about it that I've kept with me, not only a lot of the combos and things like that, but also the concept that you don't hit somebody until you've made contact with them in some way. Not so much like sticky wrist or push hands, really, kind of like that, but more like the bind in HEMA, where using that contact with a person's attack or guard or body allows you a tactile sense of their strength, motion, timing, and position that you're not necessarily going to get from your eyes, that then can tell you where their openings are, or can help you make an opening or set up a combination, feints and things like that, that create an opening and maybe keep one open or open some more. I found that extremely effective. Also started to introduce other big concepts to me that crossed over into my swordsmanship and other martial arts, such as koning, where you can kind of predict attacks to be in general. And instead of using your blocks as individual intercepts, they become more like shields and guards. So they're kind of predictive, and you can then wade into a chaotic situation with reasonable confidence, like we'll talk about boxing in a little bit. It's kind of like that. Being able to, move in, close, and get hit, and be able to get hit, be ready to get hit, and respond, and find your openings while you're getting hit. That's what I took from Praying Mantis. Still use it today. Internal versus external Chinese martial arts. You may have heard those terms. The ones that are more physical versus the ones that are more, shall we say, metaphysical. More health and spiritually oriented. Tai Chi. Yeah, I spent many years studying a couple different systems of Tai Chi. I don't do Tai Chi anymore because, after a while I realized it just didn't suit me like I thought it would. I certainly learned some good concepts in it. Not the ones that a lot of people use. Bagua. I still practice a lot of Bagua, and Bagua is another one with that inflated reputation for how amazing it is that, it's kind of ritualized. But there's a lot of core concepts in Bagua that are very, very applicable pragmatically. Circular movement and being able to use your core in developing circular power and leverage for striking as well as grappling. In many ways it reminds me of doing jujutsu, kata without a partner, if you can imagine such a thing. But again, you've got to look for the pragmatic. So I do a lot of Bagua. Probably doesn't look like Bagua and would offend a lot of Bagua practitioners. Xingyi Chuan. I do a lot of Xingyi Chuan. And again, inflated reputation within itself of having like the killer death punch. One of those other red flags when they say, you can't use this for real, it's too deadly. It's like, no. Most of that practice is very, very ritualized. And there's reasons for the body mechanics and the ritualization, but pragmatic application. I learned mostly from Xingyi concepts of chaining and Jin to be able to use my body mechanics as a whole and momentum to, shall we say, not killer death punch, but punch significantly above my weight class. Get the most power for the least effort, least amount of time out of pretty much everything I was doing from then on. So all respect to Xingyi Chuan. But again, my Xingyi probably doesn't look like Xingyi anymore. It's all right. What else? As I said, it also crosses over into swordsmanship and other wonderful things that you got to consider. And in many ways, you do have to consider it's the art over the artist. Back in the day, I got a laugh because there was a local Taekwondo instructor marketing, on television commercials. He was marketing his women's self-defense class, and this guy should not have been doing women's self-defense, frankly, because he was probably about 6'8" and made Arnold Schwarzenegger look tiny. He could kill you with ballet. Okay. Should not be teaching self-defense to people, and I'm not talking about gender. I'm talking about myself in many ways, somebody who's smaller and not as physically confident. Also, modern times, you don't necessarily have the decades to invest in self-defense. But again, when this was about, training people for battle, you didn't have 20, 30, 40 years to train a soldier. You needed to do the best you could in a short period of time that you had before they wound up out in the battle, in combat on the battlefield, and hopefully not get killed and get their compatriots killed, right? The average person who's concerned with self-defense, they might be thinking about the walk home tonight. So what could I teach that person in the shortest period of time? Well, a lot of the big stuff, and then the most useful little stuff. I also discourage in training one-stop shopping for self-defense. You buy in that one thing that's going to protect you. The keychain Kubotan thing, or the the pepper spray, or the stun gun, or the actual gun. But yes, I spend a lot of time training firearms. It's not a martial art for me, very pragmatic. But I also know that you can't rely on that device unless you already also know the how to fights, and have the backups. If something goes wrong, if you can't access that weapon, if the person does something that counters it, resists it, you need to have the other skills, or that's going to go really badly for you. So what would I recommend as kind of closing topic? Oh, stuff I wouldn't have recommended back then, frankly, because I was an idiot. My ego and things would have really disrespected these arts, and I shouldn't have. Western sport martial arts. So unsophisticated. Boxing and wrestling. They're at the top of my list now. Boxing, absolutely. Why? Because the big and the small, the timing, the maneuvering, the distancing, being able to set up and land effective hits and also take them, being able to take a hit and protect yourself from taking a hit in real time against an adaptive opponent. Yeah, boxing, top of the list. Wrestling, including other kinds of what I consider bodily grappling. Now, I certainly learned a lot of fancy techniques in jiu-jitsu and aikido, and Chinese Qinna. Hundreds and hundreds of these small techniques. But the fact is, in most live, chaotic, unpredictable, sweaty fights, a lot of those aren't going to work. And it's some of the big bodily grappling techniques that are successful in wrestling and judo and BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yes, absolutely. Top of the list. You should probably be doing both. Kickboxing. Absolutely. What's my favorite kind of kickboxing? Muay Thai. No question about it. They do so many things so brilliantly, simply, and effectively and efficiently. Muay Thai, Muay Buran. Top of the list. These are kind of things that I would recommend if you're willing to spend weeks, months training. You'll probably build up some confidence not to completely get your ass kicked the first time things go wrong in the real world on you. Hopefully. If you want to get into other things, I might recommend things like Kali and Eskrima, though some of those styles have gone a little bit ritualized. The ones that stayed pragmatic, very, very effective and efficient. Otherwise, you might be struggling against, the difference between pragmatic and ritual in any system you may be experiencing. And there's tons of people out there on the internet who can talk about the red flags. Also, a lot of people that I've watched evolve that I really didn't initially have a lot of respect for. Let's talk karate. Sensei Seth, Jesse Enkamp. I was very doubtful of those guys a few years back, but I love them now because why? They're challenging. They're investigating, they're researching, they're practicing, they're cross-training. Those guys are brilliant. Love you guys. Shout out. Check out your channels. But, all the way back around to, Japanese swordsmanship versus HEMA. Yeah. Here it comes. I promise soon. Stay tuned. Until then, I hope this stimulates some good constructive conversation. I love your comments, guys. Keep them up. Feel free to look me up on Facebook. We can connect there as well. I was thinking maybe soon I would do a live chat. Tell me what you think about that. But otherwise, as usual, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you back for more.